Yes. Thank you so much, Steph. I really appreciate it. So James is a journalist. He wrote The Adventure Gap and has written for many, many publications. He's an outdoor enthusiast, a climber, a hiker, an everything. Went down the Grand this fall. He's sort of a pretty fierce and welcoming advocate for making the outdoor industry more inclusive. And James, I don't know your title, but he is like the grand poobah of the steward guy who takes the capital's, like the nation's capital holiday tree from where it's cut down, and he helps usher it through all the different cities on this giant truck where people ride on the truck and ultimately helps deliver it to the capital. So, Grand Poobah, sir, what is your official title?
Well, I'm officially the photographer. So Grand Poobah would be a promotion. But no, I basically am the social media coordinator and storyteller of the U.S. Capitol Christmas tree. And this year it came from the Willamette National Forest in Oregon, just a little bit south of Eugene. And we just transported it over the course of 3.5 weeks by flatbed truck, 3,500 miles. Across America. I literally just got back 2 days ago. I'm home now for a bit, and then on Sunday I head back to Washington, D.C. for the lighting ceremony, and that will be on C-SPAN at 5:30 Eastern time. So if you're so inclined, you should come out and watch it because it's a really interesting event. But what's cool about this particular project is that it's a really great celebration of public land management. Because not very many people realize that our national forests are under the aegis of the Department of Agriculture, and a Christmas tree is an agricultural product. But when you're talking about one that's over 70 feet high and taking it across the country, it actually takes a pretty big undertaking of people who cut the tree down, who will take care of it, who will engage the public as we're making our way across the country. And a big part of what I do is try to tell its story as it's making its way across the country. And that kind of is a lot of what I do in general as a journalist. I try to take real experiences and then turn them into compelling narratives that ultimately people can learn things from. And in this particular case, it's really all about the importance of conscientious forestry, and how we can go about creating national forests that are not just great for producing lumber, but also for creating recreational opportunities. So hiking, camping, fly fishing, anything that you want to do, many of these things can be done in our national forests. But a big part of what I try to do, and this is what we'll be talking about tonight, is how we can go about making these natural areas more accessible to more people. And how would you like to proceed? Because I do have several slides and a couple of video clips to share as my standard presentation. But if you can give me an idea as to what happens next, I can either fire up my PowerPoint, or we can open up the floor to some quick questions and then begin from there. So what makes sense to you?
Well, I was thinking that you could fire up your PowerPoint and give a bit more sort of background and context. And I sent you sort of all their prep work that they have. Right. But I would say, I mean, at least last time we worked together, you've been very flexible. So if you're cool with folks jumping in with questions as you go along, does that work for you? Or would you prefer to give the presentation and then have sort of an exchange afterward?
Well, I'll tell you what, let me give my little presentation, and that should take about, I'll try to keep it short and tight. So, but it'll still be about 25 minutes, maybe 30. And then we can open up to questions after that. How's that sound?
Sounds great. So I'm going to send this over to you.
Great.
Hopefully.
And my first slide is already potted up. So hopefully when you send it to me, just let me know when you see the Grand Canyon.
Well, first I need to, there you are. Okay. All right, I'm making you the host. And in your talk of inclusivity, I'd love for you just to make a quick comment on, the term Christmas tree. there
No.
are more than just Christians in the world, and a supposed melting pot. How do you negotiate that as a journalist, or are you given a mandate?
Oh, you bet.
Holiday
No,
Christmas.
that's actually a really fair thing to ask, and so hopefully now you can all see my first slide. Can everyone see that? You can. Great. Well, first of all, I'm going to start off this conversation with a bit of a revelation. In 2016, I won the lottery. And I don't mean that literally, but in the figurative sense that I was part of a group of people that won a national park lottery to visit the Grand Canyon. And some of you might know that the Grand Canyon is a national park that is open to literally 4.5 million people in terms of annual visitors every year. And that's the number of people that will ultimately make the trip down the Grand Canyon to the canyon rim. But for a trip like I took by the river, the number of permits limits the number of people that will go through the Grand Canyon to only 29,000 people a year. So if you think about that, 4.5 million on the canyon rim, 29,000 people that are actually making the trip along the river, and that's a 2-week journey going from Lee's Summit, Lee's Ferry, all the way to Diamond Creek, 226 miles, all on whitewater raft. And I was invited by my friend Jim Moss, who's in this photograph here, and he's been leading trips down the Grand Canyon for literally 40 years. Originally as a professional guide, but now just as an enthusiast. He, like everyone else, has to sign up for permits. And for as long as I've known him, which is almost 20 years now, he's invited me to be part of his lottery. And it wasn't until 2016 that we actually got our permit and we were allowed to go. And we had this incredible trip. Switch back here. We had this amazing trip. We had this incredible journey together. But one of the things that happened through the course of our conversation while we were on the river was he let me know that I was the very first African American he's ever seen in the Grand Canyon on a river trip. And that kind of surprised me because, as I mentioned, he's been doing this for 40 years. And if I'm the first African American client he's ever had, or at least someone who's taking this trip with him, that kind of is kind of an illustration of what that ultimately means. Now, there are indeed African Americans that visit the Grand Canyon every year. That's not an issue. In fact, on our way out, I got a chance to meet several of them, again, on the canyon rim. But for our 2 weeks down the river, I was the only African American that I saw. And so when we stop and we think about what that ultimately means, there's a divide between who spends time in areas like this and people who don't. And this divide is something that I've described in a book that I wrote that I'll tell you about in a little bit. But when it comes to literature, when it comes to storytelling, there's a great quote from Toni Morrison that I like a lot, and it's if there's a book you want to read but it has not yet been written, then you must write it. And so that's kind of my philosophy, and I think that it's really important that if we have experiences, we can ultimately share those experiences through literature and, frankly, through storytelling. And in 2014, I wrote a book that you might get a chance to read called The Adventure Gap: Changing the Face of the Outdoors. And essentially, it is my thesis on what we can ultimately do to create outdoor recreation that is more accessible and more amenable to a wider cross-section of the American public. So the whole story actually starts in my home here in Los Angeles, California. This is where I grew up. And my parents, at least my dad, still lives in an area not too far from here. And this photograph was taken from an area that is called the Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook. And this is literally the neighborhood that I grew up in. And today there's this amazing series of trails. There's beautiful flowers, flora, fauna. There's a visitor center where a naturalist leads trips there. And what's especially cool is that it is a broad representation of the people of Los Angeles. African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, many different varieties of people actually spend time in this area. But when I was a kid, it actually looked like this. It was an oil drilling area where natural resources were basically taken out of the ground. Now, many of the oil wells still exist today, but through the work of a lot of people through the 1960s, economic and natural resource development turned that area into what it is today. And it actually starts off even further back in history during the period of the 1960s, which culminated in the civil rights movement. Now, you guys all probably recognize the guy on your left, but the guy on the right is my dad. My father, Billy Gene Mills, was the very first African-American to graduate from UCLA Law School in 1952. And as a lawyer and a civil rights attorney, he actually did quite a bit to help to begin the civil rights activism that was going on in Los Angeles in the 1960s. And if you take a look at this photograph taken for the Los Angeles Times, in that year, it reads as follows: Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Wright discusses with Billy Mills some of the problems in King's campaign to win equal rights in the Southern integration movement now being conducted in Alabama. And so in the 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to LA to ask my dad for advice on how to begin a broad conversation about race relations in Alabama, quite frankly, ground zero for racial oppression in this country. And at the time, my dad was a pretty prominent character in the movement of civil rights. Here he is meeting John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s with then Mayor Tom Bradley. Here he is again with Bobby Kennedy, not long before Kennedy was assassinated, actually in Los Angeles in 1968. Now, what's especially interesting about my dad's career was that he was kind of a mover and shaker in LA at the time. And what was really great about his career is that he was behind the scenes doing some pretty remarkable work in the civil rights movement, but he was also an avid outdoors person. He was a Boy Scout leader, and he ultimately encouraged my brothers, my sisters, and I to have a proactive relationship with nature. And here is a photograph of my family taken in the 1970s. I'm the youngest of 5. And you'll see my twin sisters, Karen and Carol, on the far right. They followed my mom into a career in education. My mom in the middle there has a PhD in education from UCLA. My brother also went to UCLA Law School, and he's now a prominent attorney in Los Angeles. My middle brother, John, is a fitness instructor and a yoga teacher in LA. And me, the youngest, became what I like to describe as the outdoor guy. So one of the things that was especially great about my growing up was literally the opportunity to spend time in the outdoors in some pretty profound ways. I mean, our family vacations were on lakes, on rivers. We went camping. As a Boy Scout, I had the chance to go to some pretty remarkable places all over Southern California. And in my earliest days, one of the things that allowed me to literally transform from being a young person who loved the outdoors into an adult who loved the outdoors. And ultimately, that allowed me to quite literally travel all over the country and many places around the world to be able to spend time in the outdoors. And even when I was in college, the Grand Canyon was a big part of my interest in ultimately being able to travel in these exciting places. In college, I went to school at the University of California at Berkeley, where I got a degree in anthropology. But I also worked at Cal Adventures, which was the outing club for Berkeley. After I graduated from college, I got a job working for a little company some of you might have heard of called REI, and actually worked right out of college. At the age of 19, literally working for minimum wage, much to the disappointment of my parents, who figured that I would go on to something else. But I took my interest in outdoor recreation and ultimately got to work for another company that you might have heard of called the North Face. And in 1992, I became the first African-American sales representative for that company and was relocated to the Midwest, where I live now, to be their regional sales manager. But one of the things that allowed me to quite literally take my love and my interest in the outdoors and turn it into a career in outdoor recreation. And from that time, I was actually able to spend as much time as I wanted to literally travel and see the world and to have these wonderful experiences. But one of the things, right up until the day I got married, back in the early actually in the late 90s. That's my wife, Shemaine, on her very first rock climbing trip. One thing constantly became aware of to me. All these pictures have exactly one thing in common. This is where I get to ask you a question. Who can tell me what the one thing that all these pictures have in common is? Anybody? This is a hard question.
The red jacket
that all these
or the red fleece.
What's that? Well, the one thing that all these pictures have in common is that I was the only African American. Throughout my entire professional career, I was woefully underrepresented among other people of color in this area. And rather than persisting in an industry that was doing very little to directly market and engage the underrepresented segments of the population, I decided to make a career change and ultimately became a journalist and created a blog and a podcast series now in its 10th season called The Joy Trip Project. And through this little news gathering and storytelling operation, I do what I can to try to tell stories about the experience of African Americans in particular, but people of color in general, in their relationship with the outdoors. And through the course of much of my time in doing research, one of the things that I discovered is that there's indeed this divide that I call the adventure gap that separates people of color and other segments of the population with regard to their relationship with the natural world. Now, we take a look statistically, blacks in America currently represent 13.1% of the population, but they also represent less than 1% of national park visitors. So 13% of the population and less than 1% of national park visitation. So if there was no direct issue with regard to race and ethnicity when it comes to the outdoors, these numbers should be very close to one another, if not the exact same. So what's the problem? So when we take a look statistically, from the year 2000 to the year 2014, the nation's black population grew 35% faster than the population as a whole. So you would think that exponentially that there would be an increase in visitation of our national parks, but that's not the case. But also, if you take a look longitudinally, the number of black citizens will grow from 45.7 million people to 74.5 million people, making up 17.9% of the US population by the year 2060. So what happens when we create what is being described as a majority-minority nation, where fully half of the population are people of color, but our interest in outdoor recreation doesn't keep pace with that? What happens by the year 2045, when the U.S. will become a minority white population, if a majority of the country no longer has an affinity for nature, the outdoors? I think that it's safe to say that we will lose many of the natural areas that we currently protect and preserve through voting and through public land management. So that's the problem. The question now is, of course, what's the solution? So when I began my interest in storytelling, it just happened to coincide with the creation of a documentary film called The National Parks: America's Best Idea. Some of you might have seen it. It's a very, it's a 12-hour miniseries by the filmmaker Ken Burns, who tells a story of how it is that our national parks were created. And in 2008, working with the National Park Service, I was invited to actually go to Yosemite and meet Ken Burns and a guy who looks a lot like John Muir, to learn literally from leading experts on exactly how our national parks were created. The guy on the left is actually an actor by the name of Lee Stetson, who plays John Muir in the film, but also in Yosemite Valley tells the story of the creation of our national park system, and how it is that we came to protect and preserve these natural areas. Now, many of you are probably familiar with this photograph of John Muir meeting with Teddy Roosevelt in the overlook in Yosemite Valley. But what's especially interesting about this particular point in history is that it was the beginning of a philosophy of natural national park preservation, but unfortunately that did not keep pace with the emerging segments of the population, including most specifically people of color. And working with the park system in 2015, we started taking direct steps towards figuring out how we can ultimately find solutions to these issues. And we created this short documentary film that I'm going to share with you in this film clip. Wave your hand.
I've been coming out to national parks for years now. And one thing that continuously caught my attention was the lack of African Americans and the lack of people of color in our parks and in the makeup of the workforce in our national parks. I thought there must be something I can personally do to change this reality.
From a statistical standpoint, what we know is that with African Americans at maybe 10 to 11% of the population and Latinos somewhere between 13 and 14%, those populations are not visiting parks in numbers that are representative of their overall percentage of the population. We know that for sure. From a National Park Service staff employment perspective, the National Park Service was about 79% white when I got started in this business in 1999, and recent statistics show that now it's about 82% white. So in the 10 years plus that we have been working diligently on this, things have actually gotten worse from a statistical perspective.
The lack of diversity in our workforce is a major issue, and we've been talking about it a lot. We've been talking about it since the 70s, and it's still a major issue today. We also have to have a culture where that's welcoming. We've made lots of strides, and there's also some room for improvement in that area.
The challenge is communicating to people that this story is really a story. Because there's also a perception that's out there that if African Americans or Asian Americans or Hispanic Americans are not visiting national parks, what's the big deal? Everyone, it's a democracy, everyone can go where they want on vacation. And the people who make that kind of statement don't recognize or acknowledge the shifts in demographics that are taking place. They're profound. That's moving towards not just a pluralistic society, but a pluralistic society that in terms of a mirror, reflects a world that we haven't seen yet, that's coming into being. And if people of color don't feel that connection, then 40 years from now, why not abolish a place that you don't feel connected to, that you have no cultural relevance for? And that's the problem. The sustainability of the national parks hinges on connecting to these communities of color, because they will no longer be minorities.
There's this mythology out there that suggests that people of color are urban. You know, people of color spend time in cities, they don't spend time outside. And I think that there's a certain amount of apprehension on the part of people of color when it comes to spending time outdoors. You know, simply because it's not something that they're used to, it's not something that they're familiar with, it's not something that is part of our culture and our history, but it is. You know, the reality is that African Americans have played a role in national park preservation ever since the very beginning. Very few people know that in 1903, over 400 African American Buffalo soldiers were charged with protecting Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. The very first superintendent of Sequoia National Park was an African American by the name of Charles Young.
Right now, there's a lot of people who care and have a lot of compassion for different endangered species in different parks. And if you look around your group and everybody's old and white and gray, the thing you're trying to protect has an expiration date. Diversity should first going forward, so the things we want to protect don't have an expiration date.
We themed this conversation off of the 1903 trip that my great-great-grandfather guided President Theodore Roosevelt into the Yosemite wilderness to talk about the issues facing the outdoors and parks of their time. And so it just seemed natural to come right back into Yosemite National Park and have a discussion on diversity and inclusion in the outdoors today.
So the whole purpose was simply to have a conversation, make connections with one another, because we see the work that we are doing separately, but hopefully this will bring the opportunity for us to somehow collaborate on solutions to this issue.
These kind of forums are really helpful. I think it can be a really isolating experience to work on these issues alone, so to talk with others and find best practices about what others are doing is really helpful.
A lot of what we've been doing is, I think, getting to know each other and really trying to understand how each of the individuals and groups here intersect with the environmental movement and what types of actions we're taking to create change within this larger movement.
This is a beginning of creating a community that can support each other in this work, because it's not easy. We've got to share power. That's a big thing from an organization like Sierra Club. We are a big, powerful organization, and we have to think about how we share that and lift up all voices. So I think this is a really great mix of people to start this dialogue, and I hope to see it grow and expand over the years.
Every conversation that groups and communities can have is a powerful tool for further empowerment. And it's easy to say that a conversation will end with just conversation, but there have been a lot of ideas thrown out today and offered today by individuals, and there have been commitments made by individuals about ways that they can go back and directly impact the work that they're doing. There are individuals in the group for whom this is a first opportunity, and that's eye-opening and empowering and inspiring for folks, as we've heard in closing remarks throughout the weekend. And that's the power of coming together and creating a learning community of this type.
Just to understand how big and beautiful and difficult and remarkable this world is has been one of the great gifts of my life.
Currently, we're looking at a number of things that divide people in this country. That's why I think the parks and the outdoors are important. It's because we can connect people in ways that maybe politics, at least to this day, have not been able to do.
I've really used parks in my own life to reduce stress and help myself get more active. Communities of color are often overlooked and don't have access to those resources. So having a park, even if it's a park just right in your backyard, can be a really great way to get access to those resources.
Doing this in Yosemite has been very meaningful. It's a very powerful, magical place, and it's very dear to my heart, and I encourage everybody to find a space that does that for them as well.
As someone who has decided to make my career related to the outdoors, I did it because I saw the transformative power that it was for me, but I also saw the transformation that it was when I was working with youth and the transformation it had for them. I want everybody to have that experience.
The outdoors saved my life, and I think that it saves all kinds of people's lives.
I know for certain that once you're out here, you'll fall in love with these spaces. That's how it was for me.
This is where I feel free. This is the place I came to find my calling. So it's just a magical feeling being in a place like this.
Whoever you are and wherever you're from, doesn't matter. If you're an American citizen, the national parks are for you. And these are places that are not just transcendently beautiful, these are places that can literally change who you are and make the best of who you are come out. Bring a smile to your face and spark an interest in your mind. These are more than landscapes. This is America. This is the real America. This is the foundation of America, and it's enshrined in all our national parks. And the Park Service only exists to keep them safe for future generations, to keep them safe for you. So come out and cash in your inheritance, but it's not the cash in your wallet, it's the cash, it's the currency that's in your spirit and in your soul.
Okay, so the historical narrative of this entire enterprise has to go all the way back to the very beginning. And when I first heard the story of the Buffalo Soldiers in 2008, that was the very first time at the age of 40 that I had heard that African Americans had a direct and pivotal role in the creation of the national park system. And I can tell you that personally it was kind of a radicalizing experience for me because, as I told you, I'd grown up in California. I'd spent much of my professional life working in the outdoor industry, and this is the first time I'd ever heard this story. And if this is the first time that I'd heard this story, that means that there's millions of people out there who hadn't heard similar stories. Now, I had heard of the Buffalo Soldiers growing up, but I really had no idea that the third African American to graduate from West Point was the first superintendent of a national park. And when you stop and you think about the historic legacy that goes into creating a direct relationship with the outdoors that is culturally and socially relevant, it can hopefully be an opportunity for us to build a bridge that ultimately will allow us to get over the adventure gap. And so when we stop and we share these narratives with people who haven't heard these stories before, they can quite literally put themselves in an environment that directly relates to their experiences with the outdoors. Now, ironically, though, 100 years ago, there were 400 African Americans in Yosemite Valley as protectors of the national park. Today, there's only one. My friend Shelton Johnson, who appeared in this film, who also wrote the foreword to my book and narrated another documentary that I produced, is the only permanently stationed African American in Yosemite Valley today. And so you have to ask ourselves, okay, what happened in the last 100 years that created this separation between the role that people of color played in the preservation of nature and the role that they play today? But the great thing about it is that once we have these conversations, we can ultimately create better unity. So that in 2008, when Shelton and Ken Burns visited the White House to share the National Parks documentary with President Obama, he told the president the Buffalo Soldier story, and he's hearing it for the first time as well. And while we can't take direct responsibility, I think that these early experiences with this president and our national park system began what ultimately became the most successful creation of national parks and national monuments for any president since Teddy Roosevelt. And so that when we stop and we think about what it means to experience the outdoors, ultimately, if we can create an opportunity to make a welcoming and safe environment for all people to experience nature in a profound way, ultimately, the outdoors begins to look more like this. So that it is indeed a direct relationship and a direct reflection of the American people as a whole. And I want to take the time now through the course of this conversation, to have you ask me some questions about what all this means and what it entails, because a big part of making this work is to be able to have, deeper conversations. And, and I'm actually kind of curious just in terms of the nature of this particular course. Is any of this news to any of you? I mean, were any of you aware that there is this division between those who spend time in nature and those who don't? I'm actually going to take a quick break here to ask some questions. What do you think about what I've laid out for you so far?
Jim, my name's Rich. Great video. That was really good. It's been eye-opening for me, this video and the comments that were made in it about how it's not necessarily about opening up the outdoors so that we can include more people from different backgrounds, but looking forward into the future and how it may, if we don't do that, it may affect, the national park system, period. That was pretty eye-opening for me, and I'd never actually considered that before.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Recently, I went on a Knowles Wilderness Medicine and Rescue expedition, and one of the people that continued beyond the EMT section was an African-American gentleman named Jason. And, through my undergrad and whatnot, I'd noticed this. I'd kind of had my attention brought to it through the courses on diversity and inclusion that we took. But I'd never really gotten to experience it firsthand or get a deeper understanding. And we were together for 54 days straight. We had a lot of conversations and kind of getting to have some pretty candid and sometimes uncomfortable conversations with him just about his view, versus his experiences. It opened up my eyes a lot. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with everything. I don't think but it has opened my mind, if that kind of makes sense. I'm definitely, because of that direct experience, questioning a lot more of just what I see, within this course. How many of us are actually white? Where's the diversity in this course? Looking back at my college courses, was predominantly white, despite having a large native population in the city in Alaska.
Anyone else? One more.
I've noticed this as well, Seth, here in Crested Butte, especially working in the snow sports industry. I was working as a group salesperson, and we had the National Brotherhood of Skiers, which was a predominantly African-American ski group. And I was managing the Western U.S. territories and just talking with them and when hosting them and going bigger. And we were a small early trip, and they host a much larger one in Snowmass. But just hearing throughout the months of lead up and work with them and interest in what we're trying to do within our community, within Gunnison community and everything was definitely a more eye-opening experience for me during those times.
Someone else said something a moment ago. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, I'm originally from a really small town in Colorado, and so I was never really aware of much of this until a close friend of mine moved to Santa Cruz, and she works for the Ventana Wilderness Alliance, and their whole thing is about getting underprivileged kids in the city and getting them out into the wilderness and showing them why it's so important to get out in the wilderness and really moving different groups of people out into the wilderness, because if we don't, how are we going to protect the wilderness if not everyone cares about the wilderness, but also just getting them out of these poverty-stricken lives they have and just showing them a whole different life they've never experienced.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, and I think that these are all very important things to be aware of, because one of the things that we have to understand is that the outdoors has not been the egalitarian spaces that we know them today. Okay, our national parks, our regional parks, were segregated. So I think a lot of people, start off with a conversation that begins with, oh, well, just go outside. Well, going outside wasn't an option for a lot of people. There were areas of transportation, of access to even, places like beaches, were designated as for whites only, or there were areas that were fully and thoroughly segregated. And when we stop and we think about, what created the environment that we live in now, we need to look no further than the racial disparity and oppression of the past. And when we stop and we think about what the civil rights movement was all about, we were talking about really important things like housing, employment, equal treatment under the law. Just profound discrimination. How many of you people think that outdoor recreation was a high priority, during my parents' time? A lot of the issues that we were working towards at the time were directly related, most specifically to issues that were related to urban equality. But outdoor recreation really wasn't a priority. And when we stop and think about, what, the civil rights movement ultimately culminated into, a lot of you will recognize this photograph as, Martin Luther King Jr.'s March presentation in Washington, where he laid out his "I Have a Dream" speech. And as it happens, though, there's a segment of that particular speech that actually makes direct reference to the outdoors. The last paragraph of the "I Have a Dream" speech reads, "If America is to be a great nation, this must be true. So let freedom ring from every mountaintop. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. From every mountainside, let freedom ring." Now, he was talking metaphorically, but I think that there's an argument to be made that he might have been speaking literally.
August 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. gives one of the most influential speeches of the 20th century at the March on Washington.
As a person who loves the outdoors and a person who loves spending time in high places and in mountains, for me, when I hear the "I Have a Dream" speech, what is most important is being able to take freedom and actually being able to pursue it. To be able to take the idea of what it is to be a citizen in this country, to be able to have the freedom to do or to go any place I want to. That means being able to go to the highest, most remote place in this country, and that just happens to be the summit of Denali.
In November, Ebony magazine features the march as its top story. Buried deep in the same issue, Ebony profiles Charlie Crenshaw. Crenshaw works for Boeing in Seattle, and he has a passion for climbing. The very next climbing season, he becomes the first African American to summit Denali. He does so via the arduous Muldrow Glacier route, starting from near sea level.
Charlie Crenshaw died in 1998, and I never met him, so I really have no idea as to exactly what his thoughts were, but I can't help but wonder if in 1964, when he was the first African American to reach the summit of Denali, if the I Have a Dream speech didn't directly influence his aspirations to reach the highest peak in North America.
So when we take a look historically, there have always been people of color in outdoor recreation, and Charles Madison Crenshaw is a perfect example of that. In 1964, he became the first African American to reach the highest physical point on the continent. So essentially the mountaintop that King was referring to. But if you take a look at his background and see where he came from, it really kind of speaks to why his accomplishment was so important. He was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was a flight engineer working with escort fighter pilots in service with the U.S. Army as airmen during the Second World War. He came back to the United States, went to the University of Chicago, where he got a PhD in mechanical engineering, but was told that as, quote, a Negro, it would be very unlikely that he would find a career in his chosen profession. But rather than taking that to heart, he relocated to the great state of Washington and got a job with the Boeing Corporation in Seattle, and was actually directly involved in creating the Lunar Lander Module program that ultimately put a man on the moon. But he was also a member of the Seattle Mountaineers. He was an avid outdoorsman. He was a wilderness guide. And in 1964, when the 37th expedition to the summit of Denali was being put together, Charlie Crenshaw was the very first person to be invited. And what's especially remarkable about this accomplishment is that this particular trip in the 1960s took fully 3 weeks longer than the current expedition protocols, mainly because you have to hike in from sea level to get to the height of the mountain. But what's especially remarkable about his accomplishment was that 7 days after the signing of the Civil Rights Amendment in 1964, Crenshaw made it to the summit of Denali, quite literally personifying King's Mountain Dream. Now, the thing about Crenshaw's story is that it wasn't publicized, it wasn't told in the national press. In fact, the accomplishment was recorded in exactly 2 places. The first was in the American Alpine Journal in 1964, an article that Crenshaw wrote himself. The second was in my book, The Adventure Gap, almost 40 years later. So when we stop and we think about what these kinds of accomplishments mean, when we tell the story, we can ultimately bring more characters into the narrative. And if you take a look at this photograph, this is actually the summit of Denali in 1964. It's not very easy to tell who the African American is in this picture. But for the sake of discussion, it's the person on the far left is Charlie Crenshaw. On the right is Alan Randall, the expedition leader. In the middle is Alan Randall's wife, Frances, who became the 3rd woman to make it to the summit of Denali. So as this photograph indicates, the mountains don't discriminate. So altitude, cold weather, natural environments don't judge you by the color of your skin, but quite literally by the content of one's character. So outdoor recreation actually has a great redeeming value when it comes to being a very egalitarian place, as long as we're prepared to treat people equally. Now, we typically think of people like this when we think of a mountaineer. Now, does anybody recognize who this is? Anybody? Okay, this is Sir Edmund Hillary. And in 1953, he became the first person to make it to the summit of Everest. But he didn't do it by himself. This is Sir Edmund Hillary with Tenzing Norgay. And Tenzing Norgay is a member of the Sherpa people who, frankly, had it not been for his representation on the mountain, it's very unlikely that Hillary would have made it to the summit of Everest. But when it came time for Hillary to visit Buckingham Palace in London to get a medal from the Queen of England, he was invited to the palace while Tenzing Norgay and the other members of his Sherpa team were literally invited to sleep in the stables. So when we stop and we think about the the treatment of people of color when it comes to outdoor recreation, they've been asked quite literally to take a back seat to other historic figures. It's also true of the first person of American heritage to make it to the summit of Everest. This is Jim Whittaker, who in 1963 became the first American to make it to the summit of Everest. But he also had a Sherpa companion that was completely written out of history by the name of Nawang Gambu. And it literally frankly, I had to look him up. I had no idea who he was. But once we take the time to tell the stories of underrepresented segments of the population, we can expand the narrative to be ultimately more inclusive. So that today an Everest climber looks like this. Now, my friend Sophia Dannenberg is one of the most accomplished mountaineers I've ever met. She's climbed Denali twice. She's climbed in the Himalayas. She's climbed in Central and South America. And in 2006, she became the first African American to make it to the summit of Everest. Okay? But once again, her story wasn't told. In fact, once again, her story was published in exactly two places. The Chicago Reader, which is a weekly magazine produced by the small community in Chicago where she's from, and my book, The Adventure Gap. You know, and once we tell the story, we ultimately have the ability to inspire more people to see themselves as part of the natural environment, to see themselves as part of the story when it comes to spending time in nature. And I think that once we start expanding our representation of who spends time in the outdoors, we can ultimately create a much more inclusive understanding of what King's dream was, and that did indeed include spending time in the outdoors. And especially when we start to talk about the importance of young people and how we can share these stories with an emerging generation of people who will ultimately become the majority of the population. And one of the things that I think is also very important is to recognize that outdoor recreation isn't necessarily or exclusively a solitary endeavor. In fact, I think that it's important that we try to bring more people into it. And so working with the National Outdoor Leadership School, also called NOLS, we worked together to create something that had never been done before. We quite literally went around the country and tried to find groups of African Americans that would come together to do something that had never been done before. We put together a team of 9 climbers, 6 men, 3 women, to quite literally take the dream that Charlie Crenshaw created in 1964 to bring it forward into a new conversation around mountaineering that we ultimately called Expedition Denali. And so by ultimately taking a group of African Americans and putting them in a very high profile, very ambitious mountaineering experience, we wanted to create a new generation of role models, and ultimately the creation of a short documentary film that we created called An American Ascent. And here's the trailer to give you an idea of what it looks like. Oops. Sorry about that. Hang on. Oh, bad. Okay, we'll try that again.
I grew up with people telling me what I couldn't do. There is a certain percentage of people who look like me who have also been told you can't because of your color, or you live in the city and this is not for you.
Think about the story that mountaineering has been. It's been mainly white male. And if a little black girl were to look into mountaineering and hear that single story, she would probably say, I don't have much of a place there.
Big problem of why a lot of people, I guess, my age aren't doing things like this is because it doesn't seem cool enough. And I think if I do it, hopefully that'll inspire other people to do it as well.
There's never been a group of black climbers coming together in an expedition to get to the summit of Denali, and that's a big deal.
It's really interesting because I don't get nervous much for many things, but I'm nervous.
And it was rough, man, just tackling the head wall with really, really heavy packs.
It's almost like the mountain dares you to make a mistake.
Last 2 days, I really have been in deep thought on whether I should continue on.
I'm just totally destroyed right now.
This shit is gonna be hard, and you know it. So as soon as you get that in your head, then you're gonna be all right. You know, just don't bullshit yourself.
Pretty clear that from here on, it's the real deal.
We're so exposed, just gotta be ready for anything.
I think we're evaluating the weather.
Conditions not optimal. I've seen one fall on the slope already.
When I get so tired that I can't see straight, all I just start thinking about is 5 steps, stop. 5 steps, stop. And eventually, those 5 and 5 and 5 add up and you're there.
So the purpose of this project was to kind of shuffle the deck, to change the characters, to quite literally change the face of what mountaineering looks like, so that we take a, perfectly ordinary high altitude mountaineering experience, but put different faces on the participants, and suddenly we have a completely different conversation. So that now to an emerging population of young people, this is what adventure looks like. And so that it's a big part of just being able to change the expectations of what one's appearance is when they're spending time in the outdoors. And so that ultimately we can actually change the expectation of what career opportunities might be. Several of the members of our cohort went on to have pretty remarkable experiences in the national park system. The youngest member of our team actually went on to do a summit of Kilimanjaro and went back to make another summit attempt on Denali 2 years later. The oldest member of our team continues to be a leading proponent of outdoor recreation, including this cover story for AARP magazine. And also a feature story that I wrote on him myself for Alpinist. And once we stop and we think about how we can change the conversation, we can bring more characters into the mix. This is a photograph taken when we presented this film to a group of 350 African American and Hispanic young people at the White House from the DC, Baltimore, and metro area. From that, we can ultimately expand the conversation beyond high altitude mountaineering, but to basic city parks. Be able to have a conversation about simple vacations with better representation of people of color in our national parks and areas. And so that when we go back to our smaller communities, we can have a much more inclusive conversation about who spends time in the outdoors. But it's not just camping and climbing, it's also about sustainable agriculture. It's about urban farming and urban parks, to literally being able to see people who are primarily urbanized as part of the natural environment. So that outdoor recreation becomes a part of one's lifestyle, and ultimately a much more inclusive environment where everyone is welcome and encouraged to participate and excel. And the great thing about it is that from this work has come the creation of a wide variety of different new affinity groups that have a specific focus on African American, Hispanic, Native American, LGBTQ, gender specific, in a wide variety of different permutations of the expressions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmental conservation, so that ultimately representation is indeed expanding. So much so that just this summer, a group called Outdoor Afro led the very first all African-American climb of Kilimanjaro. And they actually made it a successful summit of that mountain. They've expanded the conversation to actually make diversity a bigger part of outdoor recreation, so that even companies are starting to do a better job of investing in marketing and advertising. So much so that earlier this year, Outside Magazine asked me to write a feature story that appeared on the cover of the magazine that included and profiled people of color who are doing really fantastic things across a gambit in terms of outdoor recreation, from a woman who's on track to being the very first African-American female professional cyclist, to an organization called Flash Foxy that is leading women's climbing expeditions, and also a new climbing event in Alabama called Color the Crags. And so that when we go back to areas like our national parks and the Grand Canyon, we can indeed see more people of color engaged and involved there. And as it happens, I went back and did another ascent of the Grand Canyon, this time in 2018. But again, for the second time on this trip, I was the only African-American that I saw. So we still have a lot of work left to do. So much so that through my own personal efforts, I'm trying to tell new stories and new narratives. For example, another feature that was profiled in my book is the story of the very first successful expedition to the North Pole. Many of you, or maybe some of you, have heard of an African-American by the name of Matthew Henson, who in 1909 became the very first person to make it to the North Pole. But because of his race, he was literally written out of history and wasn't given the same acknowledgement that was given to a gentleman by the name of Robert Peary, who was his partner in the expedition, but got all the credit for it. And to that end, I'm actually doing personal training myself to hopefully retrace a bit of Henson's expedition to do a North Pole trip of my own. Kind of another expedition Denali-style event that will tell the big story of climate change. Because what's interesting is that 100 years after that accomplishment, that expedition to the North Pole can't be achieved today because of climate change. There's no longer a land bridge that connects the North Pole with the island of Greenland. Arctic ice actually no longer exists, and so that the changing planet is directly related to our relationship with the natural world. So I think it's really, really important that we become inclusive in our storytelling and ultimately share this narrative. And in conclusion, I'm going to share with you one final quote from Winston Churchill, who once said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And I think that it's really important that as we go through life, we change the narrative to suit our circumstances and live lives that are worth engaging in and sharing. And through that end, I want to encourage you to visit my blog and podcast and website series called The Joy Chip Project at joychipproject.com. So that's my work in a nutshell for the course of the last hour, but I'm happy to answer your questions and also to kind of open up the discussion. I think some of you might be curious to know what you can do to help move this project along. But again, I'm interested in answering your questions, so please, let's take a couple of minutes and share with me what you'd like to know.
I'm actually hoping we can do a quick pause, like a quick bio break before we jump in discussion, so I can do part 1 and part 2 recording. But I would like to note your fabulous Western sticker on your mug down there at the bottom. Ah! Nice form, James. Yes. Nice form.
Actually, you gave me that mug.
Yes. So what if we do a 5-minute bio break, get more tea, go pee, whatever you need to do, and then we'll come back. So I'm not going to end the meeting, but I am going to stop the recording. Does that work for you, James?
Works for me.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. All right. So back at like 7:30, or sorry, 6:41-ish.
Perfect.
Cool.
Great.